The Valley of Elah was a jagged wound in the earth, carved deep between limestone ridges. High above, the sun beat down, turning the dust into a fine, choking haze that hung over the Israelite camp. Frayed tents clung to the steep, rocky slopes, their canvas snapping violently in the relentless wind. Every rope was pulled taut, vibrating with the tension of a force that had long since run out of options. Below the camp, the valley floor was a stretch of barren, sun-baked gravel, silent and waiting. There was no movement among the rows of tents, only the sound of shifting stones and the distant, rhythmic grinding of the earth. The air tasted of dry earth and stagnant heat. It was a place where hope had been worn thin. The valley had become a cage, and the walls were closing in. Inside the command tent, the air was thick with the smell of stale oil and dry parchment. King Saul sat hunched over a low wooden table, his back arched like a bowstring pulled to its limit. Before him lay a map, its edges curled and stained from weeks of desperate study. He traced the lines of the valley with a trembling finger, but the ink blurred into meaningless streaks. He blinked, trying to force the geography into focus, yet the terrain remained a chaotic tangle of ink. His hand hovered over the parchment, then slowly dropped to his side, the fingers curling into a tight, white-knuckled fist. He did not look up when the tent flap fluttered. He stared at the table, his breath shallow and uneven, as if the weight of the entire camp rested directly on his shoulders. The map shifted under his palm, sliding an inch toward the edge. A low tremor began in the soles of the soldiers' feet. It started as a faint, rhythmic pulse, barely perceptible against the hard-packed earth. Then, it deepened. Thud. The sound was not heard so much as felt, a heavy, concussive impact that traveled through the bedrock of the valley. Thud. A water skin hanging from a tent pole swung wildly, spilling its contents into the dust. Thud. The vibration grew, rattling the iron cooking pots stacked near the fire pits until they clattered against the stones. Every man in the camp froze, their eyes darting toward the valley entrance. The ground beneath them seemed to heave with each approaching step, a relentless, mechanical cadence that defied the natural stillness of the morning. Pebbles danced on the surface of the ground, jumping in time with the rhythmic assault. The tent canvas rippled as if struck by a sudden gust of wind, though the air remained deathly still. There was no mistaking the source of the disturbance. The rhythm stopped just beyond the ridge, leaving the valley floor shivering in the aftermath. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and absolute. The valley floor lay exposed, a bowl of dust and heat. In the center, a single figure occupied the space, dwarfing the surrounding boulders. The sun caught the surface of his gear, sending blinding flashes of light across the slopes. He stood with his legs planted wide, his weight shifting with a slow, deliberate rhythm that kept the ground beneath him unsettled. He filled the center of the valley, a monolith of raw power that seemed to pull the very light toward him. He drew a breath that expanded his chest, a movement that caused the air to ripple. Then, he opened his mouth. The sound was not a shout. It was a physical force. A jagged roar tore through the valley, hitting the canyon walls and bouncing back with doubled intensity. It sliced through the morning stillness. He paused, his head cocked to listen to the echoes of his own voice as they died away against the rock. He paced a short, tight circle. He roared again, the sound vibrating through the air, a challenge that turned the atmosphere heavy and thick. Inside the camp, the response was not action, but a total, suffocating stillness. Soldiers stood in rows that had long since lost their military precision, their bodies locked in a rigid, unnatural posture. Every man clutched his spear, fingers wrapped so tightly around the wood that the skin over their knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. They did not look up. Their chins were pressed against their chests, eyes fixed firmly on the dirt at their feet, as if the ground itself could offer a shield against the voice echoing from the valley. This was the 41st day of the same ritual. The muscles in their shoulders were bunched and trembling, yet no one moved to break the formation. A spear shaft slipped from a sweaty palm, clattering against the rocks, but the soldier did not reach to retrieve it. He simply stared at the weapon as if it belonged to a stranger. They were hollowed out by the repetition of the threat, their capacity for resistance drained by the sheer scale of the challenge outside. They stood like statues carved from salt, waiting for an end that never arrived. The air in the camp was stagnant, heavy with the scent of dust and unmoving bodies. Miles away, the air held a different weight. The hills of Bethlehem rose in clean, sharp lines against the sky, stripped of the oppressive heat that choked the valley below. David stood on a high ridge, his feet planted firmly on the uneven rock. He held a wooden staff, his knuckles loose, his gaze sweeping across the slope where his flock grazed. The sheep moved in a slow, rhythmic drift, their heads dipping to the grass. Then, the movement changed. The flock bunched together, a sudden, tight knot of wool and nervous energy. David stopped. He adjusted his grip on the staff, his body shifting into a balanced, ready stance. Below him, near the edge of the brush, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. It was a predator, its movements fluid and low to the ground. It circled the flock, its muscles coiling with every step, eyes locked on the stragglers. David did not shout. He did not run. He watched the creature, his breathing steady, tracking the tension in its shoulders. He stood perfectly still, a silent observer in the tall grass, waiting for the exact moment the predator would commit its weight to the spring. The silence of the hills was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic thud of the predator's paws against the dry earth. The predator lunged. It cleared the gap in a single, blurred arc of tawny fur and extended claws. David moved before the beast reached the peak of its spring. His hand went to the leather pouch at his side, fingers closing around a smooth stone. He brought the sling up, the leather strap whistling as it began to rotate in a tight, blurring circle above his head. The air hummed with the speed of the motion. He did not track the predator with his eyes. He tracked the rhythm of its momentum. At the precise moment the beast hung suspended in the air, David released the cord. The stone snapped forward, a gray streak cutting through the morning light. It struck the predator with a sharp, heavy thud. The animal's trajectory shattered. It hit the ground hard, skidding through the dirt before coming to a sudden final stop. David did not cheer. He did not look for witnesses. He simply lowered the sling, tucked it back into his pouch, and walked toward the flock. He moved among the sheep, checking their flanks and guiding them back toward the center of the ridge. The threat was gone, and the routine of the shepherd resumed. The sun was climbing higher when Jesse approached the ridge, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. He carried a heavy sack, the burlap coarse against his hands. He stopped before David and held out the load. Inside, the grain shifted with a dry, rhythmic rustle, and the hard rounds of dried cheese pressed against the bottom of the bag. Jesse spoke, his voice low, outlining the task. David took the sack, feeling the weight settle across his shoulders. He looked back at his flock one last time, ensuring they were settled in the shade of the rocks, then turned toward the path. The trek began in silence. He followed the winding trail, his pace steady and measured. The ground beneath his sandals changed from soft grass to hard, packed earth. He walked for hours, the sack bumping against his back. The path ahead stretched long and empty, leading him steadily toward the valley of the war. The air changed long before the camp came into view. It turned heavy, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stagnant water, and the sharp metallic tang of cold sweat. David crested the final rise and stopped. The valley floor was a sprawl of tents, but the life had been drained from them. He walked past the outer perimeter, his sandals crunching on dry, trampled earth. No one challenged his arrival. The guards stood at their posts, but their eyes were fixed on the dirt, their fingers white-knuckled around the shafts of their spears. He moved deeper into the lines, searching for his brothers. Everywhere he looked, the scene was the same. Men who had once been warriors sat on the ground, shaking like dry leaves in a winter gale. Some stared into the middle distance, their mouths slack. There was no sharpening of blades, No talk of strategy, no movement at all. The entire camp was locked in a paralysis. The silence here was not the peace of the hills. It was the suffocating quiet of a grave waiting to be filled. David moved past the last row of tents, his eyes scanning the horizon. Then, the air vibrated. A roar tore through the valley, deep and guttural, shaking the very ground beneath his sandals. It was not the sound of a beast, but the voice of a man, amplified by the canyon walls. Goliath stood in the center of the valley, his presence a dark stain against the bright sky. He shouted again, his words a jagged blade. David stopped. He let the heavy sack of grain slide from his shoulder, the thud lost in the giant's bellowing. Around him, the soldiers flinched. They pulled their heads into their shoulders, their hands trembling as they gripped their spears. David did not flinch. He stood tall, his gaze locked on the distant figure in the valley. While the men around him withered under the weight of their own terror, David felt a cold, hard clarity settle in his chest. The sound of the giant's laughter still hung in the air when a hand gripped David's shoulder and spun him around. It was Eliab. His face was flushed, veins pulsing in his neck, his eyes darting toward the command tent. He shoved David backward, his palm striking David's chest with enough force to make him stumble. "What are you doing here?" Eliab hissed. "Go back to your sheep. You are a meddling child, playing at war while men are dying." David did not stagger. He planted his feet, his weight shifting to absorb the impact, and he did not look down. He watched his brother's hands shake. David did not offer a retort. He did not defend his presence. He simply waited for the outburst to exhaust itself. When Eliab shoved him again, David stepped aside with a fluid, practiced motion, his eyes locking onto the command tent. David turned his back on his brother, his stride purposeful and rhythmic as he began the walk toward the center of the camp. The command tent loomed, a heavy structure of dark fabric that seemed to absorb the light of the afternoon. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their spears crossed, their faces etched with the same hollow exhaustion that gripped the entire army. David approached, his pace neither hurried nor hesitant. He stopped inches from the crossed iron tips. The guards looked at him, searching for a reason to turn him away. David did not speak. He simply held their gaze. He pushed the heavy flap aside and stepped into the dim interior. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale incense. King Saul sat on a low stool, his head bowed, his fingers tracing the edge of a map that lay crumpled on the table. When the king finally raised his head, his eyes were clouded, reflecting a long-standing defeat. He stared at the boy. David stood firm, his posture relaxed, his hands at his sides, waiting for the king to acknowledge his arrival. Saul leaned back, his fingers drumming a hollow rhythm against the wood of the table. He looked at David, as if seeing a ghost, from a time when he still believed in miracles. David did not flinch under the king's heavy, skeptical gaze. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, cutting through the stagnant air of the tent. He described the ridge at Bethlehem, the way the grass flattened under the weight of a prowling lion. He spoke of the snap of bone and the sudden, sharp scent of musk. Saul's hands stilled. David moved his hands, demonstrating the precise, tension-filled moment he had gripped the beast's jaw to protect his flock. He spoke of the bear that followed, the way it rose on its hind legs, a wall of fur and fury, and how he had stood his ground until the threat was neutralized. He did not speak of glory or divine favor as abstract concepts. He spoke of the weight of the sling. Saul's eyes traveled from David's calloused hands to his steady, unblinking eyes. The king's breathing slowed. David finished, the silence expectant. Saul stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the packed earth. He gestured to the guards, and they brought forward a heavy rack of iron. It was a breastplate forged for a man of war, thick, cold, and scarred by past battles. Saul reached out, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the metal frame. He signaled David to step forward. The king began to fasten the straps, his movements practiced but stiff. As the weight settled onto David's shoulders, his spine curved instantly. The iron was not just heavy, it was a cage. It pressed against his chest, restricting the flow of his breath. Saul tightened the leather buckles, his face set in a mask of grim determination. David tried to take a step, but the metal plates locked against his hips, forcing his gait into a clumsy, dragging shuffle. He reached up, his fingers sliding over the cold, unyielding surface of the breastplate. He felt the sheer mass of the steel, a burden that demanded a different kind of movement. He took another step, his foot catching on the uneven ground, and he lurched forward, his hands flying out to catch his balance. The metal clattered against the tent pole. David reached for the buckles, his fingers working with practiced speed. The leather straps groaned as he pulled them loose. The breastplate slid from his shoulders, hitting the dirt with a dull, heavy thud that silenced the tent. He shook his arms, the sudden absence of weight making him feel light, almost buoyant. He reached for the helmet, pulling it off and setting it aside, his hair falling back into place. Saul watched, his brow furrowed, as the boy stood before him in nothing but his simple tunic. David stretched his shoulders, rotating them to work out the stiffness the iron had forced upon him. He took a deep, full breath, his lungs expanding without the restriction of the metal cage. He looked down at his own hands, then back at the king. He turned toward the tent flap, his movements fluid and silent. He did not look back at the discarded armor lying in the dust. David walked away from the command tent, his stride lengthening with every step. The air grew cooler as he descended the slope, moving away from the stifling heat of the camp. He did not look back at the soldiers or the king. His eyes were fixed on the silver ribbon of the stream cutting through the valley floor. The ground beneath his feet shifted from hard-packed dirt to loose, shifting gravel. Each step produced a sharp, rhythmic crunch. He reached the bank and stopped. The water moved steadily over smooth stones, a constant, low-pitched murmur. David knelt, his knees pressing into the damp earth. He leaned forward, his hands hovering just above the surface of the stream. The water was clear, reflecting the harsh midday sun in dancing patterns of light. He did not rush. He took a slow, steady breath. He reached down, his fingers breaking the surface of the water, and began to feel along the bed of the stream. David's fingers brushed against the riverbed, sifting through the wet sediment. He pulled a stone from the silt, turning it over in his palm. It was too flat, likely to wobble in flight. He tossed it back into the current with a soft splash. He reached deeper, his hand submerged to the wrist. He found a second stone, round and dense, and tested its weight against his thumb. This one was balanced. He placed it carefully into his leather pouch. He continued the search, his movements rhythmic and unhurried. He rejected a third stone for a hairline fracture that would shatter upon impact. He found a fourth, smooth as glass and perfectly spherical. He held it up to the light, checking for imperfections, before sliding it into the pouch alongside the first. He repeated the process, his focus narrowing until the world outside the stream bank ceased to exist. He selected the fifth stone, feeling the cool, solid mass of it. It was the final piece of his preparation. He stood up, the water dripping from his hands, and tightened the leather strap of his pouch. He felt the weight of the 5 stones against his hip. They were not just rocks. They were the tools of his trade, and he knew exactly how they would behave. David turned his back on the stream and began the walk toward the center of the valley. The ground here was hard, sun-baked clay. With every step, the walls of the valley seemed to grow taller, narrowing the sky into a jagged ribbon of blue far above. He did not look toward the Israelite camp, nor did he glance at the Philistine lines. His gaze remained fixed on the empty space ahead. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic sound of his own breathing and the soft scuff of his feet. He was a small figure against the vast, sweeping curve of the canyon floor. The wind picked up, swirling dust around his ankles. He walked with the same measured gait he used when patrolling his flock at night, unhurried and entirely present. The distance between him and the opposing lines vanished, yet he remained focused only on the path directly beneath him. He reached the center of the valley floor and stopped. He stood perfectly still, a solitary point of motion in an immense, quiet landscape. The ground beneath David's feet began to pulse with a deep, rhythmic thud. Each impact sent a jolt through his heels, a steady vibration that grew in intensity with every passing second. He did not look up immediately, keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon, as the giant closed the distance. The air grew heavy, displaced by the sheer mass of the approaching figure. Then, the rhythmic thudding ceased. A sudden, unnatural stillness settled over the valley floor. David felt the temperature drop as the sun was abruptly blocked from his view. He looked up. Goliath stood directly before him, a towering wall of bronze and muscle that seemed to scrape the very sky. The giant's frame was so immense that it cast a long, jagged shadow, stretching across the clay and swallowing David whole. The boy stood in the heart of that darkness, dwarfed by the sheer physical presence of his opponent. The giant loomed. The giant remained motionless for a long heartbeat, his head tilted slightly as if trying to comprehend the sight of the boy standing before him. He scanned the shepherd from head to toe, his eyes narrowing behind the bronze visor. Then, the stillness broke. A low, guttural vibration started in the giant's chest, rising into a sound like boulders grinding together in a deep ravine. It was a harsh, rhythmic rasp that echoed off the canyon walls, devoid of any warmth. Goliath threw his head back, the movement causing his heavy gear to clatter with a metallic ring. The laughter intensified, a booming, mocking roar. He stepped forward, the earth sinking under his massive weight, and pointed a thick, calloused finger down at the boy. "Am I a dog?" the giant bellowed. "That you come at me with sticks?" He stood over the boy, his posture radiating a predatory arrogance, waiting for the shepherd to wither under the weight of his final, cutting insult. David did not retreat. He did not blink. As the final echo of the giant's insult faded into the dry heat of the valley, the boy planted his feet firmly into the parched earth. He reached into his pouch, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cold surface of the stones he had gathered at the stream. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the leather strap of his sling, pulling it taut. He looked up, meeting the giant's gaze with a steady, unwavering focus that seemed to catch the giant off guard. The mockery died in the air. David drew a deep breath, filling his lungs until his chest expanded, and then he spoke. His voice was not a whisper, but a sharp, clear ring that cut through the stagnant silence. It hit the canyon walls and bounced back, a resonant, defiant sound that filled the entire valley. "You come with sword and spear," David shouted, his words vibrating with a sudden, sharp authority. "But I come in the name of the Lord Almighty." The sound of his proclamation hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The giant stiffened, his massive frame shifting as if the very air had turned against him. David stood his ground, his posture rigid, his eyes locked onto his target, waiting for the inevitable surge of violence. The giant did not wait for a second invitation. He roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury, and surged forward. Every step he took slammed into the valley floor, sending tremors that rippled through the dust and stones. He moved with a terrifying, heavy momentum, his massive frame leaning into the charge as if he intended to crush the boy by sheer force of gravity alone. The ground groaned under his weight. David did not stand still. He exploded into motion, his legs pumping, his body leaning forward to maximize his speed. He sprinted directly toward the charging wall of iron and muscle. He did not veer left or right. He ran straight into the path of the giant. The distance between them vanished in seconds. David's feet barely seemed to touch the gravel, his movements fluid, precise, and calculated. He kept his eyes locked on the giant, ignoring the thunderous impact of the heavy boots ahead. The giant raised his weapon, the iron tip catching the sun, but David was already inside the reach of the spear. He was a blur of motion, closing the gap with a desperate, singular purpose. David reached the point of no return. He planted his lead foot deep into the gravel, the stones biting into his soles, and shifted his weight to create a stable base. His arm snapped upward. The leather pouch began to circle, first in a slow, controlled arc, then faster, cutting through the heavy air. The motion was a blur of cord and leather. He leaned back, his core muscles tightening like coiled wire, and fed more speed into the rotation. The sling began to hum. It was a sharp, rising sound that cut through the thunder of the giant's heavy, rhythmic footsteps. The air around his head seemed to warp as the pouch accelerated, spinning with a lethal, rhythmic whistle. David's eyes narrowed, locking onto the target. He did not look at the giant's weapon or the massive, looming shadow. He focused only on the small, exposed space. His breathing stopped. He pulled the release cord with a sharp, decisive flick of his wrist. The stone tore free, a gray streak vanishing into the space between them. The stone did not deviate. It cut a clean, straight line through the heat-shimmering air, a gray blur that defied the roar of the wind. Goliath was still mid-stride, his massive frame leaning forward with the weight of his momentum, his spear arm raised to deliver a killing blow. He did not see the projectile coming. He only felt the sudden, violent intrusion. The stone struck the center of his forehead with a sickening wet crack that echoed against the canyon walls like a hammer hitting stone. The sound was sharp, final, and absolute. For a single, impossible heartbeat, the giant's forward motion stalled. His eyes widened, the fierce, mocking light in them flickering and dimming as the impact rattled his skull. The roar that had been building in his chest died instantly, replaced by a hollow, rattling gasp. His heavy, armored shoulders jerked backward. The massive frame shuddered, trembling from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. He stood frozen, a mountain of iron and muscle. The giant's balance shattered. Gravity, ignored for so long, reclaimed its hold on the massive frame. He did not fall like a man. He descended like a falling tower. The heavy bronze plates covering his limbs shifted, sliding against each other with a metallic shriek that grated against the silence of the valley. His knees buckled first, hitting the hard-packed earth with a dull, bone-jarring thud that vibrated through the soles of David's feet. Then, his torso followed. He pitched forward, his arms flailing uselessly as he sought purchase in the air. There was no grace in the descent. He struck the ground face first, the impact throwing up a thick, choking cloud of dust and grit. The sound of his armor hitting the rocks was a thunderous, discordant crash that echoed off the canyon walls, a final, jarring note in the valley's long history of fear. His body settled into the dirt, motionless, the massive spear slipping from his fingers to clatter against the stones. The threat that had paralyzed an army for 40 days vanished in the settling haze. Where a titan had stood, there was now only a heap of silent metal and still limbs. The valley floor, once a stage for mockery, was now a grave. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and final. For a heartbeat, the Israelite camp remained frozen. Thousands of men stood on the slopes, eyes locked on the dust cloud rising from the valley floor. They did not move. They did not breathe. The paralysis of 40 days held them fast, a cold grip that refused to let go even as the giant lay still. Then, a single soldier near the front line dropped his heavy spear. The clatter of iron against stone was the spark. A low murmur rippled through the ranks, growing in intensity as men looked at their neighbors, searching for confirmation of what they had just witnessed. The realization took hold. The giant was gone. The mockery had ended. Someone shouted, a raw, jagged sound of disbelief, turning into triumph. Suddenly, the entire hillside erupted. A roar surged from the Israelite lines, a sound of long-suppressed rage and blinding joy that shook the very air. It was not a disciplined cheer. It was a primal release of 40 days of terror. Men threw their helmets aside and surged forward, their voices blending. The fear that had turned them into trembling leaves had evaporated, replaced by a sudden, electric surge of power. The valley vibrated with the thunder of a liberated army. Across the valley, the Philistine ranks buckled. The sight of their champion, a mountain of bronze and muscle, lying motionless in the dirt, shattered their resolve. The silence of their disbelief lasted only a second before the panic took root. Officers shouted orders that no one heard, their voices swallowed by the rising tide of the Israelite roar. A spearman in the front rank turned, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp clarity, and began to run. That single movement acted like a contagion. The disciplined wall of the Philistine army disintegrated. They dropped their heavy shields, the metal clattering against the rocks as they scrambled to find footing on the slope. There was no order, no command, only the desperate instinct to flee. They trampled over their own supply lines, abandoning tents and banners in a frantic bid to reach the safety of the distant hills. Behind them, the Israelite soldiers surged down the slope like a breaking dam, their spears leveled, their pace relentless. The ground shook, not with the weight of a giant, but with the thunder of an army in full pursuit. The pride of the Philistine host was gone, replaced by a chaotic, dust-choked rout. They ran without looking back, leaving their dominance behind in the dirt of the valley, while the tide of history turned irrevocably against them. The roar of the pursuit faded into the distance, leaving the valley floor to a sudden, heavy stillness. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the canyon haze. In the center of the clearing, the giant lay like a fallen monument, his presence finally diminished to nothing more than cold weight and broken metal. David stood a few paces away, his chest rising and falling in slow, rhythmic intervals. He did not cheer. He did not look for praise. He simply walked to the spot where the giant had fallen, his sandals crunching softly on the sun-baked earth. He reached down and retrieved his staff, the wood smooth and worn from years of use in the hills of Bethlehem. He looked at the horizon, where the dust of the fleeing army still hung in the air like a shroud. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and change. He was the same boy who had left the sheep, yet the world he stood in had been completely dismantled and rebuilt in the span of a single hour. He turned his back on the wreckage and began the walk toward the Israelite lines. The valley was no longer a place of fear, but the cradle of a new age.